Hello, this video, Needlework Explained, is made especially for art teachers who are thinking about including some needle arts in their teaching curriculum, but aren't sure what's involved or what materials they're going to need for which types of projects. However, even if you're not an art teacher, but you are interested in perhaps trying a little needlework and you're not sure what materials you need to buy or which materials go together, this is the video for you. The questions I'm here to answer include, what kinds of needles should I use? What's the difference between knit and crochet? How much stuff do I have to buy? Why isn't this working? What is floss? What grade is this appropriate for? In this video, I'm going to talk about what is needlework and why you should teach it, basic terminology, tools and materials, and I'm going to show you some pictures of basic projects. But for more information, see my other videos, which will go much more in depth on the actual projects to use in your class. First of all, why should you teach it? Well, I teach it because I love it. But I also teach it because I see it as part of a well-balanced fine arts curriculum. Needlework is universal. You will find it in every part of the world. Needlework is historical, almost from the time we started wearing clothes. Every culture in every point of time was using needlework both to clothe themselves, to decorate their homes, but also to make lasting works of fine art. It's a basic life skill. So even if my students never pursue needlework as a hobby, I do want them to be able to hem their pants. But it's also increasingly recognized as a high art form, and you will find examples of needlework not just in folk art collections, but also in fine art collections around the world, especially focusing on contemporary art. So what is needlework? Needlework is anything that uses a needle with an eye. See, there's our eye. This includes sewing, embroidery, patchwork, quilting, applique, crewel, needlepoint, and cross stitch. But it does not include knitting, crochet, weaving, macrame, or felting. They are definitely all types of fiber art, but they are not needlework. There are hundreds of different kinds of needlework around the world, but they're divided into these basic types. The first is surface techniques. These are things like embroidery or applique. All of the needlework decoration is going on top of a piece of fabric. Embroidery is a very wide-ranging term of decorative surface needlework. Applique is specifically putting one layer of fabric on top of another layer for decorative effect. Neither of these things is sewing. You aren't actually constructing anything, you're just decorating a surface. There are many specific types of embroidery from all over the world. The next type is counted thread techniques. Counted thread techniques are more mathematical because, as the name implies, the placement of the stitch is determined by the number of threads it is crossing. Examples of this include cross stitch, black work, needlepoint, or white work. Also, you have elements of cut work in there. Whereas embroidery and applique can be more free-form, counted thread techniques are usually gridded out beforehand and follow very specific rules. Construction, on the other hand, is when you're actually putting two pieces of cloth together to make a larger piece of cloth. And this includes sewing and quilting. So rather than just putting one fabric on top of another, as in applique, when you are sewing something together, you are putting things end to end. And as I said, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of needlework techniques, but I'm going to be focusing on the ones that are easily taught in school. First, we're going to look at needles. The different types of needles are determined by their point, their eye, and their size. If you don't know what you're looking for or what you need to use, you could easily go into the fabric or craft store, look at the needle arrangement, and be befuddled, because there are so many different types of specialty needles out there. What you as an art teacher are going to want for the vast majority of these projects are tapestry needles. Categories that needles fall into are sharp and blunt. Some of the techniques we'll look at use sharp needles, and some of them require blunt needles. So buying your needle is going to be one of the most important decisions you make right after you decide what project you're going to do. If you buy a sharp needle when a blunt needle would do, no harm done. But if you buy a blunt needle when you really need a sharp, you are going to have nothing but frustrations on your hands. Speaking of which, let's talk about plastic needles. Plastic needles have their place in weaving, and I also use them in my knitting. They are not good for needlework. In instances where you need a sharp needle because the fabric is closely woven, the blunt tip is not going to go through the fabric. And in cases where it's an open weave and you can use a blunt needle, the eye is usually too large to go through the holes. I know many an art teacher has purchased plastic needles for their students thinking that they're going to be safer or easier to use, but using a plastic needle on the wrong type of material is like trying to cut your steak with a spoon. Don't do it. I start using sharp needles with my second graders. Sharp needles are no more dangerous than scissors or sharp pencils if the students are used to handle and respect them properly. The next question you want to ask is how big? Needle sizes are very confusing. So rather than looking at any sort of number, I look at the actual length. And for working with students, I prefer a 1.5 to 3-inch needle. That's going to be big enough. It's going to be easy to handle. It's also going to be harder to lose. The needles in the middle picture you can see are blunt, and the needles in the right-hand picture are sharp. Needles in a little case like this are generally sewing needles. And only the very largest ones in that case are going to be any good for teaching, and even those are going to be kind of small. You can use these at home for sewing a hem or sewing on a button, but they're really too small to teach with. And you're going to want a lot of needles, because try as you might to prevent it, they're going to lose those needles. Now the question is, can you afford a lot of needles? Well, this set is the set I usually buy each year. It has 50 pieces of large eye needles, and it sets me back $3.85 for 50 needles. Go ahead, buy plenty of needles. Threading the needle just comes through practice. There are different kinds of needle threaders you can buy. There are many tutorials on the internet that will help talk you through different threading strategies. Honestly, it just takes practice. I encourage all of my students to thread their own needles, and with these large eye tapestry needles, they can do it pretty easily. I tell them I will thread it for them, but they're going to have to wait in line. So if they can thread it themselves or get somebody else at the table to thread it for them, they can keep on stitching without waiting in line for me. You can use double or single thread through your needle. I always teach single. I really only use double knotting if I have perhaps very low skilled or dexterity challenge students. I will cave and use the double thread. But the most important thing is the knot goes at the end. Do not tie the knot to the eye of the needle. Don't do it. I know that there are teachers who have done this because they don't know how needles work or because they think it's going to be easier, but you owe it to your students to teach them how to use a needle the proper way. In the same way that when we're teaching the youngest kids to use paintbrushes, we teach them proper care of paintbrushes. When they're using marker, we teach them to put the caps back on the markers. If you tie the knot on the needle, I will find out, I will come to your school, and I will confiscate your needles. Now, how do you keep from losing your needles? Different teachers have different strategies. This is the one I really love. I cut up pool noodles into little chunks. I stick a chunk on the end of each needle, and I say, keep your needle in your noodle. When you're getting a needle from me, it's going to be in your noodle. When you bring it back to me, it's going to be in your noodle. When you're not using it, it should be in your noodle. And I always remind them, kindergartners are coming in here after you. Do not let the kindergartners find these needles on the ground. Now, there's no way you're ever going to keep elementary kids from absolutely never misplacing their needle. But I have found with the noodle strategy, I have cut down needle loss easily by 90%. Okay, moving on to thread. There are all sorts of threads and strings out there. If you don't know what to choose, it's easy to make the wrong choice. This is just going to be a quick review of my recommendations. When you're looking at the thread to choose, you want to look at the weight, that's the thickness, and the ply, That's the number of strands. Things you do not want to use: sewing thread. Sewing thread is really too thin and too fine. Just like the needles I talked about before, this is great for actual hand sewing or machine sewing. It's not good for needlework. It's just too thin. Embroidery floss is a beautiful thing for needlework, but not necessarily for teaching needlework, because embroidery floss comes in 6 strands, and it's made that way so that you as the artist can choose to use a single strand or 6 strands, or divide it any way you want to vary the thickness of the line, just as if you were drawing. It can be a little tricky even for an adult hand to smoothly separate these strands. For beginners, you're going to have a knotted mess. Skip the embroidery floss. And the other thing is crewel weight yarn, which you're not likely to buy unless you're in a craft store and you see this hanging right next to the embroidery floss. Don't get it, because the price alone is probably going to make you realize you're buying the wrong thing. Crewel weight yarn, especially sold in these tiny strands, is a beautiful fine arts material, usually made of a nice quality wool, not for teaching. Here's what I think you should use: tipped laces. Notice these laces have little aglets on the end, just like shoelaces. These are great to use with your youngest students. You don't need a needle. I use tipped laces in kindergarten and first grade before we start using steel needles. Acrylic yarn is a wonderful thing. It comes in a million different colors, textures, thicknesses. You can use it with blunt needles or sharp needles. You can use it with open weave canvas, something like burlap, and it's also good for weaving. It's also cheap, and people donate a lot of it. Now, there's no reason that you can't use wool or cotton or silk yarns, but they tend to be more expensive, tend to be a little more delicate, might snag more easily, or have bumpy surfaces, make it a little harder to stitch with. I like a nice, smooth acrylic for my kids. Other thing I highly recommend is pearl cotton. Notice it's spelled both ways, with an E or out an E. Use this the way you would use embroidery floss, but it's actually used for very fine crochet. It's nice and thick. It's got a nice heavy weight. It comes in beautiful colors, but it doesn't separate. You're not going to have that fraying problem that you have with embroidery floss. You can use this with sharp needles for finer applications, and I would recommend it for the closed weave fabrics, whereas I would use the yarn for more open weave fabrics. Should you get a skein or a ball? Definitely get the ball, because the skeins, again, can be tricky for an adult to use without getting it all knotted up. With students, you're going to have a hot mess. So definitely use the balls. They're going to be so much easier for them to use. You're not going to have the knotting problem, and you can get these real affordably in a variety of colors. Some other tools you might want to have: a needle threader and a seam ripper. The needle threader obviously is for threading needles. I don't use them, but a lot of people like them. And a seam ripper is a tool for picking out your stitches, which is something, if you're going to teach stitching, you got to be prepared to pick out your stitches. Little U shape in the bottom is actually a blade. So not only can you pick the stitches, but if you need to cut, you can just slide that up on your thread and it'll cut your stitch. Shears. You definitely need good sewing scissors. That doesn't mean expensive sewing scissors. I get a set of, I think, 25 or 26 off of Amazon, which are about $26. They come about $1 a pair. So they're not expensive. You definitely need nice sharp scissors, and you need enough for everyone to have them handy. If you're trying to cut with dull scissors or too short scissors, you're just setting up for everyone for frustration. In some cases, you're going to need straight pins. I definitely prefer the ones with balls on the end, or some other large decorative piece of plastic to hang on to. Again, so you don't lose the pins, and also that makes it easier to use. There are many kinds of special marking tools you can get for fabric. Use a marker. Unless you are a fine tailor, you don't need these things. For your school kids, a Crayola marker, a Sharpie is going to work fine both on cloth and felt. For some types of needlework, you're going to need embroidery hoops. You can usually get these for about $2 a piece. You're going to need enough for everybody in the class, but you don't need them for everybody in the grade level. The hoops don't stay on the project. They're just tools They pop off and on for every class. And the last thing is a rotary cutter. If you're using a rotary cutter, you have to have a rotary mat. Cutters are good if you are going to be cutting a lot of things. But unless you're on a production line or in high school, you're probably not going to need a rotary cutter. Now let's talk about the different types of cloth. Plastic canvas isn't technically a cloth, but it is a great base for beginning needlework. You can use these with blunt needles and yarn, or you can use them with the tipped laces, which is what I do. There are many different things that you could do with the plastic canvas, including three-dimensional construction. On the left is my first graders. Everything on the right I got off the internet. Next, open weave fabrics. Open weave fabrics are fabrics where the hole is bigger than the threads that make up the fabric. And this number system also applies to the plastic canvas. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole. So that number refers to how many holes are in an inch. So a 7-count fabric is going to have bigger holes than a 13-count fabric, because a 13 is going to have 13 holes to an inch, whereas a 7 is only going to have 7 to the inch. Open weave fabrics include burlap and needlepoint canvas. If you're using these, you want to use blunt needles and yarn, because these big holes can take big needles and big yarn. You also have to look out for fraying and snagging on the edges. So when you're using these, you want to go around the edges with masking tape. That'll make it secure and smoother. But these are also great because you can paint on them. I like to do a crewel project with my 4th graders where they paint on the burlap and then stitch over it. But there are lots of other things that can be done with open weave fabrics, such as burlap and the needlepoint canvas, for a wide variety of ages and skill levels. Another open weave fabric is called Ida cloth. You can see the numbers here. That's 14 count, 18 count, 22, 28. The C is count. And that is talking about the number of squares per inch, just like the other canvases. But the difference is Ida cloth is mostly cloth with small holes, as a needlepoint canvas is mostly holes. Needlepoint canvas tends to be much stiffer. Ida cloth can be varying levels of softness and flexible. The big difference for design purpose is Ida cloth is pretty, and so you can stitch on top of it in just a small area and leave the background plain and it will look good. Whereas needlepoint, you really have to fill up the whole fabric edge to edge to make a completed work. Ida cloth is primarily used for counted cross stitch. And before you think that's for little old ladies, counted cross stitch is actually a great project for late elementary through high school because it's all about math. If you've done any sort of pixel art, this is the same idea, only instead of coloring in the squares with a marker or a pencil, you're coloring it in by making these little X's. Students can follow a chart that's got these codes on it, or they can make their own chart. So this is a really great multi-step lesson where they do their own design, and then they encode it, and then they transfer that to the fabric by counting. And you have to count the negative space as much as the positive space. Do not be confused. This is not cross stitch. Well, technically they are cross stitches. You are making little X's, but you can buy these kits that have these X's pre-printed on them. So this is actually a closed weave fabric. You're doing embroidery on top of the lines. You're not counting anything. So even though the stitch is technically a cross stitch, this sort of thing is a completely different animal than counted cross stitch. Here's some pictures just to give you ideas of the ways that you can employ counted cross stitch for your students. From the simplest geometric designs to really complex shading. Moving on to woven cloth, which most of us would just call cloth. Yes, you can definitely make all sorts of projects with woven cloth, and this includes cotton, flannel, wool, medium weight, poly blends. People will give you leftovers from their quilting projects. Old shirts and other clothes will work. Recycling clothes is a really fun way to use woven cloth. I don't recommend doing denim or silk. Denim, because it is so heavy and so hard to stitch through, that you usually will need a pair of pliers. So that is really for more the advanced stitcher. And silk for the opposite reason, just because it's so fine. You really need a nice, sturdy, medium weight, anything from shirt weight fabric up to a heavier flannel or wool, but not so heavy as denim or duck cloth. For needlework on a woven cloth, you're going to need a sharp needle because the holes are not already there. In the open weave fabrics, we already had holes. You need a sharp needles to poke those holes. You're usually going to need an embroidery hoop because you're going to need to keep that fabric taut and flat. Whereas some of the open weave fabrics were already stiff, you could just hold them in your hand. A softer fabric is going to need a hoop to hold it tight. And as I said, pearl cotton is a wonderful thing to stitch with. Woven fabric is good for embroidery, applique, quilting. As you can see, there are many different levels of skill that you can use a simple woven cloth. Now let's take a minute to talk about non-woven. Often when you're shopping, if you see something called non-woven, they're talking about polypropylene. It's the stuff that these shopping bags are made out of. This is a great fabric if you're cutting and gluing, but it's not really good to stitch on. So I would not recommend that. What I would recommend is felt. Felt is lovely to stitch on. Comes in wool or acrylic. It comes in so many colors, comes in different thicknesses, comes in different sizes. You can get it with patterns. It's easy to cut. It's easy to stitch on. It can be glued. I love working with felt. Some things to keep in mind when you're buying though. One, the thickness. Also, besides just the thickness, which is going to be measured in millimeters, you want to see if it's described as soft or stiff. If you're going to be stitching on it, you want it to be soft. Stiff felt is more like a pressed paper. It's got a lot of sizing in it. It's really good for cutting and gluing, but it's not good for stitching. Soft is what you want. The other thing is you definitely want sharp needles. I have talked to more than one art teacher who in their frustration has told me that they bought plastic needles or dull needles to use on the felt because they thought that that would be easier or safer for the kids. Remember, we just talked about open weave and closed weave. There are no holes at all in felt. It is non-woven. So if you try to push a blunt needle through the felt, it's actually going to be more dangerous because it requires so much more pressure, is so much more frustrating. You definitely need a sharp needle for felt. The other thing you need for sewing with felt is felt. Don't get confused by fleece or flannel. Both of those feel fuzzy and soft, and they all start with F, but fleece is actually a knit fabric, and it's not good for stitching on at all. And flannel is a woven fabric, and it is wonderful to stitch on, but it's not felt, it's something else. So here are some of the things that my students have made out of felt. Good for all ages, many different skill levels. I especially like to teach with felt when I am teaching adults on cruise ships. It is so versatile. And the last kind of cloth I'm going to talk about is recycled knit. I actually have my own small business that I've been running for about, 20 years, which is making these funny little monsters out of old clothes I get from the Goodwill or Salvation Army. This is a great material to teach with, especially your middle school and high school students. They can do some more complex work. It's easy to cut. A lot of it doesn't fray. It can be sewn with blunt or sharp needles. It comes in an endless variety of colors and patterns. For your high school students who are interested in fashion, this is a great entryway. If you don't have access to machine sewing, your students can make their own clothes using thrift store t-shirts, sweaters, socks. Now I've just got a couple more pieces of vocabulary I want to throw at you. As we said, needlework is something that uses a needle with an eye, pulls the thread. This is a sewing needle, not to be confused with a sewing machine needle, which is a different thing. Stitch is a verb. it's also a noun. So a stitch can refer to the different patterns, the straight stitch or back stitch or feather stitch. It can also apply to the individual movement of pulling each individual stitch through the fabric. Sewing, as I mentioned before, is sewing two pieces of material together side by side. So what you see on the left there, that's stitching. That is not sewing. Not that anyone is going to come up and correct you, but if you're teaching, you might want to know the difference. Let's talk about quilting specifically. Quilting is a term that's misused all the time. Piecing is the act of taking small pieces of fabric and piecing it, sewing it together side by side to create new shapes, traditionally block. Patchwork or applique is sewing the material on top of each other. So instead of being butted up next to each other in a very regular pattern, patchwork can be much looser and things can be on top of each other in a more random pattern. Or sometimes appliques are done very methodically on top of piecing or on top of a flat piece of fabric. Quilting requires 3 layers of fabric. Generally speaking, in a traditional American quilt, the top might be pieced together, the backing could be a solid piece, and the middle is what we call batting, and that is a fluffy piece of material, either wool or polyester or cotton. In order to technically be called a quilt, those 3 layers must be sewn through together. And this can be done with very intricate stitching, or it can be done with simple knotting. But not all quilts are pieced, not all patchworks are quilted. So these are specific terms for a specific type of needlework. And to revisit briefly what is not needlework, knit and crochet. These are actually forms of knotting. You'll notice that the difference here is there is no fabric to start with. The act of knitting and crocheting is actually creating the fabric, which I can knit, but I can't crochet. But I do like to brag that I can make my own clothing and shelter with 2 sticks and a string. That's a pretty good skill. Knitting, you're forming the knots with 2 smooth sticks with points on the end. They're called needles, but as you can see, there's no I. And crochet uses a single hook. Often this is casually referred to as needlework, and again, the needlework police are unlikely to stop you, but it is in fact a method of knotting, like macrame. So hopefully this is going to help you at the Hobby Lobby or the Michaels. To get more detailed information on the specific projects I do at each grade level, you can watch my video, Learn Needlework in Only 12 Years, which of course is a funny title, but if you've only got elementary, just watch the beginning, and if you've only got high school, just watch the end. I have many videos on other art teaching subjects on my YouTube channel, but needlework is really my specialty, so as time goes on, you will find more and more specific needlework videos on my channel. So, as always, I'm putting my whole curriculum online. Like and subscribe, and please comment and post pictures because we all love to see what everybody else is doing.